I don't think there's ever been any other band like the Doors. Whether it had been their attitude or the way that they did their thing. They were like a rock band, but it was psychedelic for the era that they were in.
I would be a liar if I was to say to you, girl, we couldn't get much higher. Come on, light my fire.
They had such a mixture in their music. They weren't just a straightforward rock and roll band. A lot of people think the Doors is Jim Morrison, and it's easy to forget about the band members, but they were really great musicians, all of them.
This is the end, beautiful friend.
When you watch the Doors, be it in black and white or any concert footage, it's pretty fascinating, you know, to watch a guy like Morrison on stage, in whatever state of mind he was in. It's pretty intense, you know. I think what rock and roll was all about and is all about. I think a lot of that has been kind of lost.
Yeah, of laughter and soft lies.
He was like the true kind of pioneer of that style, and anything that's followed has just been a cheap imitator.
You know the day destroys the night, night divides the day. Try to run, try to hide, break on through to the other side.
Anyone who ended up being a fan of the Doors would have to attest. First time you hear Jim Morrison's voice over the backdrop of that music was, I don't know, life-changing might be a bit of hyperbole, but almost life-changing.
But can you still recall the time we cried? Break on through to the other side, break on through to the other side.
1967 was the year where it all started for rock. We had Sgt. Pepper, we had the Velvet Underground and Nico, and we had the Doors' first album. Now, the Doors have often been linked in with the Jefferson Airplane as the flag wavers of the West Coast counterculture. So the first album was obviously very important and one where they really wanted to make a mark. It's interesting that they actually recorded it in 2 weeks, and they recorded it with a producer that they hadn't met before, a guy called Paul Rothchild, who produced all but one of their albums. Turned out to be a marriage which Elektra Records made, but it was one that was made in musical heaven.
The Doors emerged at a time when there was a whole revolution going on. I mean, 1967 is always held up as the year when everything changed. Really, all the groundwork had happened in '66. That's when, you know, the Beatles changed, which had a great effect. The Stones were starting to change, and over on the West Coast in America, they were slavishly copying English bands, as they always did, but then they used it as a kind of jumping off point. And you can't underestimate the input of LSD in all this, but I mean, one of the main bands doing the LA clubs at that time was Love, with Arthur Lee, and the Doors were fans of Love, and Love went from being they were always a bunch of hoodlums, and they went from being like an R&B punk band to getting very ornate and floral with their arrangements. So it was really down to individuals finding themselves in this new climate, which was breaking away from the initial UK invasion thing. And Jim Morrison, you know, he met Ray Manzarek on the beach. Already had a song called Moonlight Drive, which he sang to Ray. And that was the first Doors song that was ever recorded. And it was unlike anything, really, because, I mean, you had four. It was the classic thing, again, of having four members of the group and you couldn't take one away, which was very, very much proved when Jim died and the Doors carried on. They had a chemistry, and that was evident on the album. I mean, the first thing the world heard about the Doors was Break On Through. That was the first single.
The drummer opens with a slight jazz riff. In comes the keyboards, kind of accenting with the drummer. To make that a little bit thicker, the guitar player mimics the keyboard player. Suddenly the song is starting to swell. It's waiting. Then all of a sudden a strange sound, like a moaning guitar or a moaning bass sound, just kind of goes in and out, kind of just making that sexual throbbing sound. And then the voice. Absolutely incredible. What a great way to open an album.
Break On Through was the first song on the album, and it really established the Doors as a non-flower power band. Many of the bands in the 60s, the Summer of Love was 67, were all about flower power, and this song was about a new journey. Many Doors fans know that a lot of their music was based on William Blake's poetry, his perception of going through doors to find out what's on the other side, which the Doors did. They did not want to follow the natural ways they should be doing things. They were non-government, non-conformists, and going through the door led their path, and that was about break on through to the other side of the door.
Doors of Perception, you know, all this Huxley, classic Morrison, lyrics, you know, short, sweet, big hit for the band, and will always remain a classic staple on rock radio. Love that song.
Break On Through, that was a song that the Doors performed a lot in the bars. And it's got a neat beat to it, very different. And that was the one song that the Elektra was really pushing as their first single. So the first time that they did a tour up and down the coast here on the West Coast, that was a song they played a lot, and that was a song that they were pushing. And it did get a lot of radio airplay, but it wasn't until Light My Fire came out that's when everyone started taking notice of the Doors. But it's a really good song, and it's a great way to lead off the first album.
What's beautiful, I think, about the debut album by them is that it doesn't turn its nose up at the idea of pop music. The songs are lovely little 2-3 minute songs that could appeal as much to a teenage pop audience as to a rock audience. But within that, they've got this lovely literary quality, so both audiences could appreciate them. The kind of teenage fan girl audience could like them for their catchiness and for their sexiness, and the more rockier audience could appreciate them for their literary references and for the musicianship and so on. And I think this was to be one of the things that defined the Doors throughout their career, was this very clean sound and this thing of not being afraid, of being poppy, of being catchy.
Hesitate is through, no time to wallow in the mire. Try now, we can only lose, and our love become a funeral pyre. Come on, baby, light my fire. Come on, baby, light my fire. I just said the night out. Oh, yeah.
Of course, Light My Fire was the first big Doors song. That would be the second single. In America, that was released as the full, 6.5 minute version, and they didn't edit it, and that was startling. No one released, well, Dylan had, but nobody really released singles that length with these amazing solos, and that kind of like, that was the template for the Doors sound already.
The song was originally 7 minutes long, but they had to make a single length, get it down to about 3 minutes time, which they cut out the keyboard solo and Robbie Krieger's guitar solo.
They had to do a radio edit of it because the song was way too long for AM radio. And people started hearing it on AM radio. It went way up the charts. And the FM players, all the stations could play the long version. And it was a real sign of the time type song. It came out, and you know, throughout the year 1967, that was their hit. And a lot of people, when they play stuff about the 60s, they'll play that song because it really encapsulates an era.
Light My Fire, you know, the late 60s, let's say, it really was typified. It was that 3-minute burst of pure pop, but what the Doors did is they added just that little bit, you know, that little bit of Doorsism, as I like to call it, you know, Jim Morrison's influence as a songwriter, made it just a little different than what the Beach Boys, let's say, were doing at the time. It had that kind of California sound almost, but again, just veering slightly left of center.
Light My Fire turned out to be a pretty successful single for the Doors and one of the songs they'll always be remembered for. But it wasn't written as a single. They basically came in, created an album and thought about the commercial possibilities afterwards. It was a song written by the guitarist Robbie Krieger. People probably assume that Jim Morrison, because he was the singer, wrote a lot of poetry and was generally an all-round outgoing guy, that he wrote all the songs, but that's actually far from the case. In this case, Ray Manzarek, the keyboard player, came up with the signature introduction, and John Densmore came up with the beat, the drum beat, and Jim came up with some of the lyrics in conjunction with Robbie Krieger. So it was really a band effort, and one which I think was justly, or is still very much justly associated with them.
When I talked to Krieger about Light My Fire, he said it was the first song that he ever wrote, because Morrison came back to them and said, I was tired of writing all of the songs, go and write a song. So he goes back to his place and thinks, well, geez, it's got to be a pretty heavy song. What is the topic? Like, okay, what's heavy? Earth, fire, water. Let me write about fire. Fire is pretty cool. So he goes and wants to sort of copy Hey Joe that Hendrix came out with. And then just one thing led to another, and boom, out came Light My Fire. First song he ever wrote.
When the Doors came out with Light My Fire, both on record and to the television audience and Ed Sullivan, they really presented themselves in a light that would have been very different had they done A Backdoor Man or When the Music's Over or The End or any of the other tracks that the Doors came out with. Because, let's face it, Light My Fire was a crooner's masterpiece. It could have been a Sinatra song, but it wasn't. It was this leather-clad rock and roll frontman named Jim Morrison, who was unlike any of the crooners that our parents grew up with. And yet it sounded like a crooner's song.
You know that I would be a liar.
The Ed Sullivan Show, a very popular TV show in North America in the 50s and 60s. Elvis, when he was on the show, they weren't allowed to show him from the waist down. They had family values. Well, it was the same. They asked Jim, please don't use the word higher. Can you say something else? Well, Jim, being the rebel that he is, got to the word and yelled it even louder for the TV audience.
Probably first and last time that band was on, Ed Sullivan.
The End was, I think, a different approach in terms of songwriting for the Doors, whereas, you know, they always had that rule where songs didn't have to be a certain time to get on the radio, and if it was a long song, then who cares, you know? And it very atmospheric, and it shows the skill of Robbie Krieger as a guitarist as well. That, you know, the style that he had was, it's like he could adapt to anything, you know.
This is the end, my only friend, the end of our elaborate plans, the end.
It's not a rock and roll beat. The end is, you know, on here that was on the cymbals. It's this slow, moody kind of thing. It's not, come on, baby, you know. And although I saw heads bobbing up and down out there, so I knew we were on to something.
You picture what will be, so limitless and free.
Kind of a bizarre song. Parts of the song talk about a child who murders his father and then has a sexual relationship with the mother.
Father, yes, son. I want to kill you.
Get out. You are no longer the house band at my bar. What the hell are you singing about? The story went down that they were the house band at the Whiskey A Go-Go, and when the owner of that club heard Jim do that in all its glory and Oedipus complex rhetoric, get out. And people still comment on the song that way today. For those of us who are a fan, bring it on. Play it again, Sam.
The End is the last song on the album. Also an album that was chosen through many concerts to be the last song, working people into a frenzy. This is what I call the San Francisco sound. This is a song that toys with you. This is a song that takes you to a peak and then brings you back down. I'm impressed by the journey this song takes you through. It's why I say the San Francisco sound. There's a particular sound that came out of San Francisco. Most bands that were out in the 60s, 7, 68, 69 had the sound because that was the sound of the equipment. The producers all kind of took a little bit from each other. Also, I believe the musicians knew what they were capable of doing with this equipment, so putting their input in. A lot of bands back then were also trying to for those who weren't taking drugs to be able to hear the sound of drugs. And it was just an amazing time. And I think this song is so important because it's a long song. It's a song that takes you on a journey. It's San Francisco.
This is the end.
The End was, to me, kind of like When the Music's Over Part 1. It was just sort of a hint of things to come, you know, from Jim Morrison and the things that were inside his head. Kind of a twisted song, really long song, probably the longest song of its time, you know, at that time. But kind of a twisted song, both lyrically and musically. I mean, you could be high on drugs, but you really didn't need to listen to it. It was just one of those way out there kind of songs that we started to hear a lot more of after that from Jim Morrison and the Doors.
The end of laughter and soft lies. The end of nights we tried to die. This is the end.
I think at the time when their first album came out in late 1966, early 67, I mean, The drug influences was all throughout rock music, and I think that it would be difficult to say that that didn't have an influence on their music. Certainly marijuana was in use at the time. I think though more with Jim Morrison, it was mostly alcohol fueled that sort of drove him. But I think definitely the drugs probably did play a big part. Maybe at the first part it added some influence and flavor, and maybe in some points it actually hurt the music quite a bit.
It was almost impossible for the Doors to follow up arguably one of the best debuts in rock history, but I think they did it with Strange Days. Released within the calendar year of 1967. This was back in the days when rock bands would put out material at a torrid pace. So 10 months later they come out with Strange Days. A lot of people say there was no way it could live up to the bar that was set by the debut, but I think it did. It has some great Doors staples on it, and it's a fantastic record.
Here's an album that confused me, and I enjoyed it. It was surreal. It was psychedelic. The tasty things I liked about this album was Ray Manzarek's bouncy keyboard. At times it sounded like dripping water. At times it gave you a rainbow effect. I'm not trying to sound too hippie-ish about this, but the guitar player was the most impressive on this album because he had somehow invented or created haunting guitar sounds. A lot of slide style guitar appeared on this album more so than any other album. It was really haunting to listen to some of these sounds and layering and that.
The cover of the first album had very much majored on Jim Morrison. The other guys were rather in the background. So they said to Elektra Records, well, we'd like to have something a little bit different on our second album cover. And they came up with what looked like a strange burlesque circus scene with the band members notoriously absent. So quite what was going on there, I'm not entirely sure.
The cover on it was a very different throwaway from what the first album was, where you had these images, especially Morrison's image, which took up half the album cover. And on Strange Days, the Doors said, we don't want to be on the album cover. But then finally they relented when Elektra said, well, you have to be on it somewhere. So in the very back corner there's a poster of the Doors, like it's a concert poster. So it's really funny that they knew they were very big and popular, but here they were trying to take a step back, kind of.
Love me 2 times, babe. Love me twice today. Love me 2 times, baby. I'm gone away. Love me 2 times, yeah. One for tomorrow, one just for today. Love me 2 times, I'm gone away.
Love Me 2 Times is one of those Doors staples. It has everything. I think the neatest part is that it has a harpsichord solo from Ray Manzarek, throwing in that just what the Doors did. They took what was pretty much a straight ahead song and they added just a little bit of, obscurity to it, and they throw in a harpsichord solo. Ray Manzarek, who was fantastic on the keys as always, but I think that every member of the band brought something to the Doors music, and that was Ray Manzarek's moment to shine, I believe.
I think it's got a lot of really good feel to it, and it's got some neat keyboarding in there. It's got some neat drum rolls. Of course, it's got a bit of screaming from Jim Morrison, and it's a very good single. In less than 3 minutes, you got a really good song that has lots of power and lots of energy.
So if you listen to the lyrics in that song, you'll notice that Morrison drops off the S. That has sort of a double meaning. Love me 2 times. Listen to it. I think you'll agree.
Love me 2 times, I'm gonna play.
Love Me 2 Times is a shuffle, and really fun to play for me, because the standard way to play a rock and roll shuffle would be da 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 da, and I found myself going I played all across the drums, and all these drummers said, what are you doing? And it was different. I don't know, I found a unique way of playing, and it's just a blues.
The riff for Love Me 2 Times is based around an E chord, and he's basically using the open strings in between. So, but it's the way he's putting them, it just makes a great riff. So the main riff goes. And what he was doing there was just moving up to like an A major shape. And then it's the bridge bit, using a lot of 7th chords, so it goes to a D, D7, C7, and what he was doing there was just a run G, D7, which is giving it that ring, C7 and B7, rather than using straight chords, which would have just sounded normal, you know. He's using that, which is, the Doors used a lot of that, you know, I think because of the, to complement the keyboard perhaps.
Love me 2 times, girl. Bless me out through the week.
Love Me 2 Times, obviously a huge hit for the Doors, one of their biggest ever, some would say. But it's almost intriguing to imagine what could have been, because the song was doing well on the charts. This was, of course, at the time when the Doors were a huge live draw. Jim Morrison, the infamous bust in New Haven, Connecticut. The song was steadily rising on the charts at the time, and funnily enough, it enjoyed a sharp decline afterwards. So you know, it's almost, that's one of those things you would love to, what if he hadn't been busted, what would have happened to Love Me 2 Times? But then again, maybe the Doors wouldn't have been the Doors if he didn't get busted. So it's probably best to leave it the way it happened in history.
By the time of Strange Days and the second album, they were starting to have problems with the dynamic within the group, which isn't unusual. Lots of groups have that, especially when there's one charismatic frontman who's getting a lot of attention and 3 sidemen or musicians who are not getting as much attention, but feel that they made as much of a contribution, if not more. And one of the problems was that Morrison rebelled against what made them good, I think. He actually rebelled against the pop sensibility, and the others complained that any time they got together, he would want them to play hour-long blues jams. Anytime he got drunk or lazy or got fed up with being a pop star, he would revert to what was almost a persona of being this kind of semi-drunken, rootsy blues man, because he could. And I think it brought out the worst in him. And of course, you're in that position where people won't criticize him because he's the figurehead of the band. They need him. So they have to put up with his games. And it wasn't good for the music, I don't think, at all. He started to play games, I think. He would hold them up in the studio. He would take too much time. He would piss off the engineer and the producer as well as the band. And they would have... I can't remember the exact figures, but the first album only took days to record, whereas by Strange Days they were doing take after take after take, hundreds of takes.
In terms of the studio and what the music they were actually making, they had a far better studio setup for the second album. They had all of 8-track recording equipment, And they were very keen to make an album that was an advance on their first. Musically, perhaps in a way it was. In other ways, obviously, very few second albums make the impact of the first. But Strange Days wasn't a bad effort.
At that point, the Doors started to do some more what they wanted as opposed to what was sort of expected of them.
With the Strange Days album, I believe this was the first album that Jim Morrison actually broke out in poetry, rap. He was very sincere about that. It's just like the music stopped and they decided, let this man say his words.
People are strange when you're a stranger. Faces look ugly when you're alone. Women sing wicked when you're unwanted. Streets are uneven when you're down. When you're strange, faces come out of the rain. When you're strange, no one remembers your name. When you're strange, when you're strange, when you're strange.
The way People Are Strange works is it's basically based around two chords, which are E minor and A. But instead of Robbie Krieger playing it just like, he's doing all these intricate parts in between. So it's almost like he's playing the bass as well. And I think that's something to do, obviously, with the fact in the early days they didn't have a bass player as such, so he's trying to fill out everything he can by doing bass runs as well with all those bits in between of playing the guitar. So it's kind of like he's playing two instruments, you know.
People Are Strange was perhaps the Doors' attempt to recreate the success of Light My Fire, which hadn't been intended as a hit single, but when it was edited down from its longer version, became one. So on each album from then onwards, generally the Doors would try to find something that could come out as a single. People Are Strange was a reasonably successful single, and they're perhaps on the poppier side of their music.
People Are Strange, another good song. Is that was another Morrison one. I believe it was based on a poem that he'd written. And it's got a neat little, some neat codas in there. And it's like so many Doors songs. I mean, you listen to a lot of their album tracks that weren't released as singles, they really stand up on their own. And I would say definitely that's one of them. You know, another song you hear still today on the radio. And it's something I think that really draws people to the Doors. I mean, they've got some really neat things in their music. And it's like no one else at the time was doing something like that.
I heard the story that from Manzarek that Morrison was pretty depressed at the time. Went over to Krieger's house, talked about it, and I believe they went for a drive and watched the sunset. And the lyrics just came out of Morrison. People are strange.
When you're strange, faces come out of the rain. When you're strange, no one remembers your name. When you're strange, when you're strange, when you're strange.
Even the title, Strange Days or People Are Strange, I think they're stating something. Oh, this is strange. Whereas if you look at the first album, the songs just were strange, and they would use, the lyrics weren't particularly odd or strange or trippy, but the feeling on the first album was strange and unnerving. And there are good reasons for that, in as much as you stay within the pop song, but within that you make it, with the use of chords or lyrics, you make it slightly odd, slightly unnerving. The moment you sit down and say, I'm going to write a strange, trippy song, it's going to come out dated. It's going to end up sounding dated. And the problem was Morrison was encouraged in this by sort of hangers-on and so on. I think there's a point with all drugs when it starts out really, it is a revelation and things do look new and wonderful. Most drugs are like this. You have a honeymoon period and you can work on them, and everything seems new to you and you can make it work with it. But then at a certain point, it starts to drag you down a bit and it loses its edge and so on. And I think that definitely happened with Morrison. And he reverted to booze, which was a disaster for all concerned, I think.
Probably the coolest thing about Strange Days, for me, as a fan of the Doors, was that it featured When the Music's Over. A tour de force, a great finale for a record. It was to that album perhaps what The End was to the Doors' debut.
When the music's over, when the music's over, yeah. When the music's over, turn out the light, turn out the light.
It was on the B-side of Strange Days, and it was the last song, another very long song. The story about how that title for that song came along was when they were playing at the London Fog, I guess they would get into some sort of debates with the management about playing late or causing fights with people, bar patrons and this kind of stuff. And apparently the owner of the bar would say to the bouncers, you know, when the Doors had finished playing, when the music's over, turn on the lights, right? Just to get everyone out of the bar. And I guess Morrison thought that was kind of funny, or thought, hey, I can use that in a song. And so that's where the title of that song came from.
Turn out the light, turn out the light, turn out the light.
There's a big part where Jim screams, and he didn't let out a big scream, but you could feel him holding it in, and it was interesting to me. I like it because it was, you know, contained, explosive.
Tied her with fences and dragged her down. They ripped her and bit her and stuck her with knives in the side of the dawn. This is Jim talking to you as a Native American. This is the Native American in Jim. He says when he was 4 or 5 years old, he was out in the desert with his mother and father, and they came across, it was at dawn, and they came across an overturned truck, and Indian workers, migrant workers in New Mexico, were on the highway, scattered on the highway, a couple of, maybe a half dozen of them, and he says, bleeding to death. Indians scattered on dawn's highway, bleeding. Ghosts crowd the young child's fragile eggshell mind. The spirit, and he says the story, there was nothing we could do for them, but he said, I get the feeling now, looking back, that the spirits of one of those Indians, maybe a couple of them, jumped into my body, and they're still in there.
When the Music's Over is actually compared to The End, which was the last song on the first album. Again, another epic track. Not as long as The End, just over 11 minutes long. The End was 11 and a half minutes. Ray Manzarek really showing his skills as playing the bass line on his keyboards. A song, you can only say that it was so full of passion and also very intense.
A fantastic Doors song, one of the best ever, in my opinion. I think what made When the Music's Over such a great song and a hallmark for the band. It's an 11-minute song, which is not out of the ordinary for the Doors, but it started what would be a long line of great album closing songs. It was one of those where they might take a few more chances in those songs, and I think, you know, for the time, and there was a lot of race riots and protest music, this is a great protest song because, as everyone knows, in it Jim Morrison screams, "We want the world and we want it now." You know, dealing with political issues was nothing new for the Doors, but I think this is one of the best examples of how they did it with a great song and a great message.
Till the end, until the end, until the
In 1968, the Doors' third album, Waiting for the Sun, came out, and a lot of people assumed that the Doors had run out of ideas by this point. This often happens with a lot of bands. Their first album will come out, great songs, their second album, and then by the time the third album comes along, they've been touring for the last 2 years. They haven't had time to sit and write, or to be playing a lot of different things and having the time to write and produce stuff. And a lot of people claim that this was the problem with this album. A lot of the songs on it tend to be maybe a little bit melancholy, but there's still some excellent music on there.
Waiting for the Sun, the Doors' third album, was probably when a little bit of backlash set in. They had been acclaimed as being fresh, new and different, but by the time of the third album, perhaps the cracks were beginning to show. They were a band that did create things together, but there was a feeling perhaps that maybe the natural linkages, the natural teamwork had run its course, and that something new was going to have to come. So Waiting for the Sun was probably the first time that the Doors really copped any critical flack.
Successful with new fans. A lot of people accuse them as making an album targeted towards teeny boppers or the teen movement. A lot of hardcore Doors fans weren't happy with this, but it was still a very successful album.
Hello, I love you, won't you tell me your name? Hello, I love you, let me jump in your game.
The first single off Waiting for the Sun was Hello, I Love You, which came out quite a while before the album did. That's another song written on the beach in 1965. An innocent song written by Jim when he saw a girl walking past and just started singing along to himself, Hello, I love you, won't you tell me your name? Which he sang to the melody of All Day and All of the Night by the Kinks, which was so obvious on the record, the Kinks sued and they ended up having to pay the Kinks royalties on that song.
Hello, I love you, let me jump in your game. Yes, I want to be with you on a bedside Monday, and all the night.
When the band went in to record this album, they weren't really prepared. And I think a lot of fans noticed this, especially on the song. A catchy number that it is, I think fans kind of thought it wasn't their best effort, and they wrote a lot of the material while they were in the studios, whereas before they really prepared for each and every album. And I think true fans noticed that it wasn't as good as it could be, but they still liked the song.
Again, the Doors could be accused of retreading their past. In fact, in this case, they were retreading somebody else's past. But it was the hit single on the album that the Doors and their record company expected to produce each time around.
She holds her head so high, like a statue in the sky. Her arms are wicked and her legs are long. When she moves, my brain screams out this song.
The big heavy keyboard, it's just got such a beat, it just makes you want to shake your ass, you know. It's just a great rock and roll song from the Doors. They were known for, you know, they could give you a great rock and roll song like that, but then they would do something else that was so out of left field that you'd forgotten that they were even a rock band. A song like that reminds you that, yeah, they're indeed a rock band.
Waiting for the Sun, in the eyes of a die-hard Doors fan, I think most people would agree it is among their weakest records. And I don't think that's necessarily what's included on the record. I think after two great albums in a row, Strange Days and the debut, it was almost impossible that they could live up to the bar that had been set and the standard that they had achieved for themselves. I do think it lacked some of the firepower and some of the imagery in the songs that Jim Morrison and the Doors had accomplished earlier, but I do think that it is still a decent album for sure.
Waiting for the Sun, an LP that spawned an incredible piece of poetry, Celebration of the Lizard. If you have the Foldgate, you'll see this poem. In Canada, there was a lot of albums put out, but they were just a single sleeve, and it didn't show this unless there was a slip of paper on the inside. It gave you the Celebration of the Lizard poem. This album was probably one of my favorite albums Two other albums also very good in their repertoire of albums, but this one here did an awful lot for me.
Wait until the war is over and we're both a little older.
The song starts off with great quiet lyrics, but then comes in with the band and a great marching drum beat.
Breakfast where the news is read, television, children fed, unborn living, living dead, bullet strikes, helmets hit.
Unknown Soldier, very popular with true Doors fans, anti-war song, which is what you wrote about in that time in the 60s. You wrote about flower power, or you wrote about anti-war demonstration.
Unknown Soldier was typical perhaps of the Doors' third album, in as much as people looked at it and said, well, it's rather too closely related to Break On Through to the Other Side. They were a four-piece band, they didn't have a bass player, they had a very specific sound. In fact, I mean, there were three pieces as regards instrumentation. And because they weren't really ringing the changes at this point, people could always look at a song and see, well, maybe it's been done better or earlier on another album.
And it was very experimental in the studio too, using all of the sound effects, and you know, they actually used a rifle in the studio with blanks, of course, firing it off, and it worked. It was pretty interesting for the time.
I think the claim to fame with that song was when they performed it live, and Jim would recite the little piece of poetry in the middle bit of the song there. He would actually fall to the ground when the guns were fired. He would fall dead to the stage, and that had a pretty strong effect on stage for the time, especially given the time of the century that it was there, the late 60s.
Make a grave for the unknown soldier, nestled in your hollow shoulder, unknown soldier.
I think the role of Paul Rothchild, the producer, would have to be looked into, because I think they later rebelled against him. And I think if they'd had a different, a more sympathetic producer at that time, more psychologically acute, who could deal with them both as a group and Morrison as an individual, I think they needed someone new to come in from the outside there, who wasn't part of the dynamic, and someone who could have got the best out of them at that point, who could have said no to Morrison, basically, and given the others a bit of confidence and so on. They would have gotten much better results at the time.
Robbie Krieger was playing around with this flamenco guitar riff called Asturias, which is like a classical guitar figure, and it became Spanish Caravan. Mazarek hopped aboard that, and they turned it into this kind of, flamenco epic. I mean, that was Doors' creativity, nothing to do with Jim though. Doors' creativity between the three.
This is the first time in a Doors song that I've heard Robbie Krieger go outside of a country style lick, a blues lick or a jazz lick. Was the intro to Spanish Caravan. This flamingo style, very different. I get goosebumps every time I hear this. I've heard many other bands steal this incredible piece from you, as you probably did in a roundabout way, was influenced from somebody else in order to play this piece. Almost the first time I've heard Robbie Krieger get dirty with his sound. This is just, and I couldn't get enough of it. I just wish he had layered another track of this on top of it, just to help the song as it went along from this delicious psychedelic sound.
And in true Doors fashion, it really starts to electrify. Maybe you can compare it to a folk band like the Byrds or Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. But the way it starts surprises everyone, and then all of a sudden you go, oh yeah, it's the Doors, because it finally electrifies.
Spanish Caravan, see, this is where the Doors kind of lose me. Some of these slow songs with, it's basically poetry over top of some kind of musical background. A little bit hard to listen to. Maybe it made sense in the 60s, in 1968. It's kind of hard to go back and wrap your head around what songs like that's all about these days, I find anyways.
Spanish Caravan was pilloried by, I think it was the LA Free Press, as being perhaps the worst lyric of any rock song they'd ever heard. So I think everyone was aware by the time that Waiting for the Sun had been issued and reviewed, and generally in a downbeat fashion, that something was going to have to change. So the Doors saw that and they made the changes.
In terms of a sound, the Doors seemed to me to be another one of those bands that really had that niche, that really unique sound, sounded unlike anyone else. Sure, they came out of the late 60s psychedelic era, but no one else sounded like the Doors, and for two reasons. I guess Jim Morrison's voice was unlike anyone else in rock and roll, more like a crooner than a rocker, and the combination of that keyboard that no one sounded like. You know, Ray Manzarek's keyboard was so unique.
Ray Manzarek was the musical backbone of the Doors to many people. He had a very distinctive style, and part of that was using his left hand to play the bass notes without a proper bass player until the very end of the band. Somebody needed to be holding down the bottom end. Didn't always work too well because the equipment of the time and the amplification of the time weren't working with him. But clearly the kind of playing that he contributed to the Doors was very much a part of the sound, and I think any other keyboard player there would have had a job making the same impact that he did.
Someone who brought the keyboard to the limelight in a band, whereas usually before they've, you know, keyboard players or organ players have always been sort of standing in the background while the guitar players and bass players and everyone have been up front. But he was the one who was like, well, listen to me, I'm playing the riffs here. Don't worry about any of the others. I'm the one who's got the hooks to all the songs and everything. You know, an incredible musician and really knew how to play the organ. And there's been no one else like him really who's ever done anything like that, you know, with that instrument since.
Ray believed that the rhythm was the center of everything, which is what he provided, and without rhythm, you had nothing.
I believe that the strongest musicians there was Ray Manzarek first. Very tasty keyboards and different tones. I think that he must have had a lot of input in helping the producers and convincing the record company that this is the type of stuff that people should be listening to. I honestly believe that they were able to control their volumes to be able to put out these records that were absolutely clean. You could hear every note, everything was in tune. I found that the guitar player, Robbie Krieger, he too was very clean. He also must have spent some time being able to intertwine his guitar work with the keyboard work, maybe accenting together at times and other times playing between each other.
Robbie Krieger was just a great, solid guitar player, but probably doesn't get the applause he should for his lyrics. A lot of people think Jim Morrison was the main lyric writer. He was the poet of the band, but on a couple of the albums, Krieger really did shine as a main songwriter.
The bottleneck slide and the tone of Robbie Krieger as a guitarist, again, unique in rock and roll in the latter part of the 1960s. Nobody really had a sound like that. Simplistic, yet complicated at the same time.
Robbie insisted on getting a wine bottle and breaking the end off to slide up and down the strings. Unfortunately, Jim would drink the wine, you know, before the show.
The best ones, I believe, were those cheap champagne bottles like Charles Krug, you know, and you just bash it, you put a rag on the neck and hit it with a hammer. And sometimes you got lucky and it would be perfect. And other times it would be kind of jagged, like the one on the show that was a quickie, so I didn't have time to file the edges down.
You know what, Krieger probably won't rate as one of the best guitar players of all time, but I think he really did the job that was needed with that band. I don't think he could have put, you know, Eric Clapton in that band and he'd be out there doing his thing and it just wouldn't work at all. I think what Krieger brought to the band was, like I say, sort of just spice. He dropped things in when he felt necessary. I don't think he was a very confident guitar player, and I think that's sort of where it came from. He sort of played when he felt comfortable almost, but as songs got structured and put together, it all seemed to work somehow.
Hello, I love you, won't you tell me your name? Hello, I love you, let me jump in your game.
The drummer, he was the backbeat. He did a few tasty things. I don't think he was as strong as the other two.
When you listen to their live stuff and the fact that with Morrison, you never really knew what he was going to do next. So you listen to Densmore's drumming and he's constantly keeping the same beat, and then Morrison may scream and then go into a song without any kind of warning. And I mean, if you've ever been in a band, you know you need that sort of warning, or you need a count-in or something, and he's always on cue. So you got to give him credit for that. He was really paying attention and listening, and could keep a steady beat through all their songs.
Tell me your name. Hello, I love you, let me jump in your game.
Any drummer playing with the Doors would have to be able to drive them on when they were driving, lay back when Jim Morrison was having one of his rants. The Doors' music had a lot of peaks and troughs, so a drummer would have to listen very carefully to what was going on and basically fit in with the style, unlike, say, Status Quo, where you'd be playing 4/4 straight ahead boogie all the way through the song. So John Densmore was a drummer who basically could rock when he needed to rock, lay back when he needed to lay back, a few jazzy touches here and there. So perhaps he didn't need to be an all-round virtuoso.
You know the day destroys the night, night divides the day. Try to run, try to hide, break on through to the other side, break on through to the other side, break on through to the other side, yeah.
But the input is very strong from all three of them, and my hat is off to them, because I really do think that these guys were very, very in tune with each other.
It's funny, people tend to always look at the Doors as being sort of Jim Morrison's vehicle, so I think maybe the other musicians got a bit of a short shift, because the record companies and the teen magazines really pushed Jim Morrison up to be more than what he was, and I don't really think he really was pleased with that image. I think he sort of saw the band at the beginning anyway as a unit, and that he shouldn't actually be the superstar, although it was hard not to be with his stage performance and stuff like that. But I think that definitely they've influenced a lot of people with their style of playing, and I think as the years go by and they find more live footage of them, I think you're finding a lot more contemporary musicians and rock musicians really appreciating the kind of music that they were developing and doing at the time. They were real innovators for their time.
Deep and wide, break on through to the other side, break on through to
Ladies and gentlemen, once again, the Doors.
I think for me, the Doors were a live band.
Come on, come on, come on, now touch me, babe. Can't you see that I am not afraid?
They laid it down in the studio so they could get to the stage.
A lot of their live performances are fantastic, I think, and I think they show the band up very well. Unlike a lot of bands at the time who were kind of put together in the studio, they really could play, and if you listen to them live, some of the performances are scorching, they're fantastic.
And live, it was much more of a different experience. You had Jim Morrison, who very much was playing up the audience, and he would always, it was a performance. You didn't know exactly what he was going to do, and that was the same for the other three musicians in the band. They didn't know what he was going to do. So it was quite a unique experience. I don't really think any one or two of their shows were ever the same.
I don't know if Jim was performing for the crowd or performing for himself. He could just lie down on stage and just go off into a tangent, into his fantasy land, into his visions of what his lyrics and poems were all about.
I think this was also the first time I'd ever seen someone wearing leather pants. I was so used to suits or matching t-shirts or outfits that were all tying the whole group into it. And here's this guy caressing the microphone, throwing out these delicious sex looks into the audience, and women almost to the point of passing out, thinking this man was looking at them, singling them out. This was just absolutely mind-blowing stuff to watch, and my hair stood on end. I just could not believe what I was seeing.
The Doors thought the Soft Parade was going to be their version of Sgt. Pepper. They were really going to throw everything into the mix and come out with something that was the Doors, but something that hadn't been heard or experienced by their audience before. Unfortunately, the impact of it was rather let down by the fact that during the time it was being recorded, tracks were being released as singles. So in fact, of the 9 tracks on the album, 5 came out as singles, which may have happened in Michael Jackson's time, but it didn't happen with Sgt. Pepper, and obviously diluted a little bit of the impact. They did manage to get a recording budget of $80,000 for this record, which in those days is not too bad. So I think Elektra are expecting something pretty big and important, and as I say, had these tracks not been released as singles, then maybe the total impact of the whole thing would have been as was expected.
Again, they're working with Paul Rothchild, their producer of choice. Maybe it was his influence, as George Martin influenced the Beatles by bringing in the orchestras. It could have been Rothchild himself by saying, "Here, let's try this." Maybe not emulating what the Beatles did, but it was hard for fans not to want to compare to what the Beatles had already done.
Come on, come on, come on, come on, now touch me, babe. Can't you see that I am not afraid? What was that promise that you made? Why won't you tell me what she said? What was that promise that you made?
Obviously, the track that people know and love, that I've heard most of, is Touch Me. Come on, come on, come on now, touch me, babe. Again, a lot of people have criticized it because it's sort of, they thought at the time, a blatant commercial attempt at the Doors to have a pop hits. And I mean, well, yeah, it was a pop hit. It crossed a lot of, formats. Although there wasn't a lot of formats at the time when that song came out, because album rock radio really hadn't kicked into high gear, mind you. But I never get tired of this song. I always crank it up if I'm in the studio or if I'm in the car. I love this song, Touch Me.
Touch me, babe. Can't you see that I am not afraid? What was that promise that you made? Why won't you tell me what she said?
It's interesting that Touch Me was originally going to be titled Hit Me, which obviously was rather more confrontational. It's also interesting that Jim Morrison was the man who decided it would be Touch Me. I think people think Jim Morrison was basically getting on stage and getting his bits out, and that's how perhaps we view him at this distance. I wasn't ever lucky enough to see him, but he knew that basically to go one step beyond, as it were, might harm the chances of the music being heard. So he was quite happy to rein back a little bit and make it Touch Me rather than Hit Me. Of course, on stage he would hit anyone and anything he fancied.
Gonna love you till the stars fall from the sky for you and I.
Touch Me is just a great single on its own, real swinging Doors, and probably a great use of the orchestra on the album, the great sweeping surround sound that filled it up. Again, unless we can ask them, maybe Rothschild's decision, maybe the band's decision, but a song that would probably been okay without the orchestra. It was very poppy, very catchy, but the orchestra just really filled it in.
Touch Me was the big radio hit, and it did okay for them. Kind of pales compared to some of the other radio singles that they had previous to it. I think the true Doors fans really like Soft Parade, but I don't think it was as commercially successful as the ones they'd had before.
When that album came out in July of '69, The Soft Parade, it was, I think, in a lot of ways, kind of a step back for the Doors. It was very different. The producer at the time wanted to add a bunch of different flavors to the songs, brought in some brass into a lot of the songs, like Tell All the People and stuff like that. Even like with Touch Me, where there was like an orchestra, strings, you know, there was a brass in it and everything. And it really didn't seem like a Doors album. But I think when you listen to it on its own, it's not too bad. It's actually it's different. I mean, it's any kind of band is going to try things and experiment, and sometimes the experiments work and sometimes they don't. And I think you know, looking at other Doors albums, maybe you know, you might think that one just didn't fit in properly, but I think it does have its place.
The Doors put out Soft Parade. I think a lot of people felt that they'd gotten a little too soft, you know. The title was apropos. Outside of Wild Child and another couple of tracks, perhaps, the band was really getting a little sweet in terms of their production and their sound. Perhaps too sweet for a lot of us.
The song Wild Child, I think the origins came from Morrison's personal experience with a girlfriend whose name escapes me at the time. I don't think it was Pamela Corson. There was one previous to that whose name I can't remember right now. But that one, I mean, you listen to the lyrics with that, and I mean, man had a crazy life with a lot of crazy people, and you know, what more of an appropriate title to call it Wild Child.
Natural child, terrible child, not your mother's or your father's child, yo.
Wild Child is another brilliant Doors track, even though it's down-tempo, but it's got a great solo by Krieger, a very, very bluesy, almost like a crying solo that is a highlight to Doors fans who are Doors fans had a favorite band member, and then, like I said, Krieger really shined on this album lyrically and with his guitar playing, and he really shines on this song.
Well, thunder at her heels, freedom in her eyes, she dances on her knees, pirate prince at her fellow idol's eyes.
Their earlier 3 albums were very psychedelic, very true rock and roll. But people started to hear the influences of other bands like the Beatles and the use of the strings. And I think they were trying to experiment with a different, not softer sound, but how to put a soft sound within what they already do very well.
Wishful, crystal water covers everything in blue.
Wishful Sinful is a Robbie Krieger song, and it's about love and sex and like that.
You know, with that song, I tried to really get into the subconscious mind, you know, trying not to write about anything particular, but trying to use images, you know, water and blue, and I think Jim really liked that, you know. And that's what I kind of tried to do. I tried to write songs that sort of fit in with what he was writing.
Wishful Sinful is again another Krieger classic. Very upbeat, kind of swinging, great driving bass. A lot of fans think this is one of Jim's finest vocal performances on this song. Not a very popular song, not the hit single that you would hear on the radio all the time, but to true Doors fan, they thought Jim was at his best, yet singing Krieger lyrics.
It turned out like a Frank Sinatra ballad or something, and very fun to play. A real sort of ethereal. I'm trying to think. Yeah, you should ask Robbie, what the hell does he mean? Breathe underwater till the end.
Huh? Well, like I say, it's supposed to be what you think, you know. It's just a bunch of images, and the listener is supposed to make of it as he will.
The Soft Parade, which is the title track, last song on the album, again, to a lot of fans, probably one of the finest performance songs to wrap up any of the Doors albums. Fans really like this song. Fans really like what the Doors did at the end of every album with that last song, where a lot of albums, you get halfway through the second side and you're kind of going, oh, the Doors didn't do that. They bookended their albums very well with a great song at the beginning, and usually an epic song or quite a long song at the end to entice the fan to flip it over and start it again from the beginning.
Peppermint, chocolate candy, champion sax and a girl named Sandy. There's only three ways to get unraveled. One is to sleep and the other is travel.
The Soft Parade is a 5-part suite. It's a suite of disparate pieces that we put together to create a whole.
It has several different sections. It's kind of like an opera. And I just love Jim's looking up like Jesus. He's singing, "Give me sanctuary, I must find a place to hide." This is during the Miami trial.
It was a tough song to play. It was had so many parts and stuff. And when we recorded it, you know, we did it in sections, so it wasn't something that we had worked out on the road and just brought into the studio like a lot of our stuff.
The monk bought lunch. Yeah, he bought a little bit. He ate it. All right. Now, this is the best part of the trip. This is the part I really like. Really like it, yeah. All right.
I do like a few songs on that album. I also think that the few weaknesses that might have occurred depending on who was writing the songs, in some cases they were love songs. It seemed that Krieger enjoyed life and enjoyed loving, and so there were some simple songs and Jim probably had to sing them in the way that he had written the lyrics. There was band turmoil, so I think that there was some unrest and probably some ill feelings towards certain members of the group. Therefore, in some of the sessions where this occurred, that weaknesses did show up. I think there was an awful lot of concern in regards to the charges laid to Jim Morrison for some of the antics that were pulled on stage in front of the public, some accepting it, others not, like hockey games. Some people like the fights, some would rather sue if a fight broke out. I think people were shocked more back then because it was so different for what he was doing. So with these charges pending, not knowing what the results were going to be, booking studio time at the same time that these feelings were going on, also again a sign of weakness probably occurred through some of these songs.
Having produced an album that was all bells, whistles, brass and How's Your Father, the Doors decided they'd revert to type with Morrison Hotel and basically go back to being a four-piece band playing very basic music. That's probably actually why Roadhouse Blues was taken up by Status Quo as one of their concert tracks, because they could see in the Doors, Morrison Hotel version of the Doors, a basic band getting down and playing what was almost blue-collar rock.
It's obvious that they had sort of thought they'd gone too far with the horns and the brass on Soft Parade, so what do we do best? Let's go back to the roots, let's do some blues. So Morrison Hotel was back to the blues, and boogie. Roadhouse Blues, I mean, great start. You know, John Sebastian playing harmonica on that. It was just a sort of, again, they were back to being a bar band, and you know, that really kind of showed. It was like a big sigh of relief. You know, there was no restrictions of doing songs with, you know, 50-piece orchestras and stuff like that.
Not perhaps the showiest of their albums, but certainly one that's stood the test of time.
lot of people thought Roadhouse Blues or Morrison Hotel was back to basics, some bar blues, what these guys do best. I would have a tendency to agree. They came from a different gear from the previous album, kicked it into fourth, and lit up and drank up, and keep your eyes on the road, your hands on the wheel. From what I understood, at least Menz-Eric told me this, that Morrison was riding in a car and his girlfriend was, using her hands to talk and wasn't keeping her hands on the wheel. Whether it's a true story or not, I don't know. It makes sense to me, and that's where some of the lyrics came from. Roadhouse Blues, Peace Frog, always a great radio favorite for people to call up and continuously ask, what the heck is that? Peace Frog, and then segues into Blue Sunday. I think the album as a whole is a fantastic, gritty bar room blues rock album from the Doors.
When you hear the first notes of Roadhouse Blues come blasting out of your stereo, you only have one thing to do: turn the volume well up to the right.
Let it roll, let it roll. Let it roll, let it roll. Let it roll, let it roll. Let it roll. All night long. Yeah, man, come on.
It was raw, it was gritty, the recording quality was a little muddy, but I think in the song Roadhouse Blues, which was an original, it almost sounds like it was a cover song of an old 12-bar blues from the 50s, but it showed again what the Doors could do when they put their minds to it, and they turned out, I think, an enduring blues song.
In 1970, when Roadhouse Blues came out, it was an interesting time for the Doors. They had a lot of things going on within the band themselves. There was lots of disagreements. Morrison at the time was being charged in Florida with public exposure. There also was a situation when he was flying with a friend of his, and they got into a squabble with the stewardess, and there was going to be some charges pressed against Morrison and his friend, dealing with disrupting an airline and stuff like this. So I think at the time the band was maybe in a lot of ways getting kind of fed up with Jim, because he was probably a lot more trouble. He had to have handlers to look after him and stuff like this because of his drinking and stuff. But with Roadhouse Blues, I think they kind of returned to their roots as far as being a bar band. And Canned Heat they really liked the band Canned Heat. And when you listen to Roadhouse Blues, or to a lot of the songs on that album, you hear a lot of influences like Canned Heat. You hear that kind of boogie music. And so I think Roadhouse Blues was refreshing for the Doors. They were actually doing something that maybe they needed to do, sort of to purge their system of all this experimental stuff and get back to some sort of rootsy music as far as their history is concerned.
Save our city. Save our city. Right now.
I think by that point in the band's career, they were certainly getting better as musicians, but they were also a lot bigger. So yeah, the cult status had certainly died down a little bit. They were just another one of the big rock and roll acts out there by that point. But certainly their playing together certainly was a lot tighter. Jim was getting a little more difficult to control, but the band themselves were, I think maybe because Jim was such a wild man, the rest of them stuck together pretty tight, and it certainly showed in their playing.
Let it roll, let it roll. Let it roll, let it roll. Let it roll, let it roll. Let it roll. All night long.
When LA Woman came out in 1971, I think the Doors at that point weren't really sure if there was going to be any more Doors after that. I think in Jim Morrison's mind, I think he was kind of finished with it. He was really branching out into other things, He really wanted to get his poetry published. He had sort of done the rock star thing. Plus also I think his personal life might have been in the kind of situation of flux and things like that, that I really don't think he envisioned himself doing any more music probably with the Doors. But at the time, a lot of people assumed that these songs were going to be sort of throwaway songs, songs that were like left in the can sort of thing, get this last album contract out of the way with Elektra and then we can move on kind of thing. But they had some awesome songs in that album. And a lot of people consider it to be their favorite Doors album.
LA Woman kind of consummated everything, I think. You got the balance between a good sound and good songs and good performances. I think that is probably, that could be underrated. You know, it's not held up there with, I don't know if you would hold it up with Pet Sounds, but I mean it is a kind of an innovative, influential album which did define an era.
Well, I think it's a wonderful album. It's probably my favourite. Not that it isn't without flaws, but I think it works for similar reasons to the first album. But I think that is key, that Paul Rothchild, who'd done all the other albums, for whatever reasons, whether he'd had enough or they'd had enough of him, he exited and left it with Bruce Bocnick, who'd been the engineer on all the other albums. And whether he brought something fresh to it or whatever the reasons, it definitely it has this whole new strength and sense of purpose and a different sound as well. It actually sounds very different from the other albums.
A lot of people consider this their comeback album. Even though their previous producer didn't want to work with them because he thought it was too mellow or too much like lounge music, it really was great, true Doors music. LA Woman, the title track, is probably one of the greatest driving songs of all time, definitely up there with Deep Purple, Smoke on the Water, or Golden Earrings, Radar Love. It is just a great driving track. And to Doors fans, this was their comeback album. They were back after two albums that were okay. The use of the strings, I think, turned off some of the fans, but this album made fans think, hey, the band is back.
LA Woman, the title track, obviously a great song in itself, but a turning point for the band, and it's sad that it came on their final record. But I think that Robbie Krieger shows something that perhaps he hadn't shown earlier, which is just an exploration of the guitar and of his influences. He touches on so many people and goes so many places during this song. You know, he's buoyed by Jim Morrison's performance, which is an absolute classic on this song. Some people say the song is about LA itself. Other people say it's about the Doors' longtime publicist who is from Los Angeles. They think that Jim had dedicated this song to her, who is a secret love of his. Regardless of what the lyrical meaning of the song gets down to, I think that Robbie Krieger's performance in this song is one of his best.
Krieger, who I've spoken to, has said that the LA Woman track is the quintessential Doors song. They just went into the studio, came up with a riff, moved the thing down to the G, and then he didn't know how Morrison came up with the lyrics, but he did. And It's such a great song, you know. On a sunny day, the top is down and you're driving with the radio cranked up and LA Woman is just screaming out of the speakers. It's fantastic.
LA Woman itself was a jam. You know, that had, they've been jamming on a song from, it was called Ghost Riders in the Sky. It was an old Cowboys song. And they've been jamming on that for some reason. And Jim had joined in. And, you know, they just played with it for 8 minutes. And I don't know, he'd managed to find that tone on his piano, which just gives it that endless highway kind of feel. And there just seemed to be a good spirit going in the band.
Driving down your freeway, midnight alleys roam, cops in cars, the topless bars, never saw a woman so alone, so alone, so alone, so alone. Motel money, let a madness.
LA Woman was their last official release. I'm sure they would have had a lot more material for another album had Jim been around to do it. Many of their songs never made the albums they were written for. It took 5 or 6 years for some of their songs to even make albums. So I'm sure they were into, each album they were into a different groove, but they were a lot more prepared for this album. And I think they knew when they recorded it that they were making to them what would become their masterpiece.
LA Woman was a very surprising album. I don't think you would have expected an album of such high quality to have come out of the Doors at that time. I think a lot of it depended on Manzarek, Krieger and Densmore's interplay.
LA Woman saw the Doors going forwards and backwards. They went backwards in as much as they slimmed down their recording gear. They took an 8-track studio equipment into their rehearsal room, and they decided that they'd play and record at the same time and have an organic feel to what they produced, maybe play a little bit more loosely than they were used to in a studio when the red light came on. And they also took the opportunity to recruit a rhythm guitarist, Mark Benno, and a bass player, Jerry Sheff, because they weren't really happy with the idea of playing the bass on the keyboard. Sometimes it worked in concert, quite often it didn't. And so what had become a trademark had become a little bit of a liability. So they decided, okay, we'll expand the band, we'll record it in our rehearsal rooms, we'll see if we can produce something that's maybe a little less contrived, a little more organic than what we've been producing of late. And of course LA Woman would turn out to be their last album due to Jim Morrison's sad and mysterious death. But in many ways, it reignited interest in the band that had he died after Morrison Hotel would not have been there. So LA Woman, for all the fact that some Doors fans don't like it, can actually be blamed or credited for the band's status as it remains today.
I think Doors fans and music fans would say that this was their best effort. True Doors fans said this was their comeback album, and they couldn't wait until the next. Of course, that would never happen.
The Doors' LA Woman, their final record, Jim Morrison died not that long after it was completion, after he moved to Paris. I think a lot of people, much as they do with Nirvana's music, there is only a certain amount of Doors music that was recorded and released. People want to read something more into it. Are there, hallmarks, and is there evidence of Jim Morrison's impending demise on LA Woman? Absolutely. The lyric, I've been down so goddamn long, it looks like up to me. You can't get much lower than that. And I think even in even in the mess of booze and drugs that he was in, he was very unhealthy at the time, I think he still managed to pull out a great performance of himself. And I think that was a testament to the power of Jim Morrison. He could be as drunk and as out of it on drugs, he would still deliver when it came down to it.
I was really stunned to hear that he had died because of the last album being so good. And I just couldn't get enough. They were one of those bands, a lot like the band Cream, where they put out only 3 or 4 albums, and I just couldn't get enough of what they put out. I didn't think that they had fully matured and that they were ready to call it quits.
Upon my repeated conversations with Ray Manzarek, particularly over the last several years, I asked him what killed Morrison, and he just came right out and said, drugs and drink. You know, they knew halfway through their career, albeit a short one, that they knew the drink and drugs were killing Morrison, and it was just a matter of time. So yeah, it's influenced the band heavily and certainly influenced Morrison. Some call him one of the greatest, if not the greatest, rock poets that ever was. You know, a man tormented, depressed, an interesting shamanistic background to, you know, acid trips. I mean, all of the qualities, I guess, that you want a rock poet to have, and I think he rates right up there. An amazing lyricist and poet.
I think he was first a poet and then a performer. I think most poets want people to hear their work, whether you're by yourself or within a group, and he would be on stage reciting his poetry. It's just that his poems fit so well with the music of the rest of the band, which enabled him and drove him to perform the songs even greater, or perform his poetry to a higher level.
Wishful, crystal water covers everything.
But I think even to this day, people love to hear poetry, and women love to hear poetry. And sometimes they probably don't even hear what he's saying or hear what he's singing, but they're captured by this great presence, this great-looking guy in tight leather trousers, reciting to what I think is coming out of his head is poetry. He's not singing a song, he's reciting a poem, which to him means so much, as it usually does to people who write poetry. And I think that's what helped the ladies swoon over him.
See, I know where I would like to be, right back where I came. Wishful, simple, wicked blue, water covers you.
Jim Morrison's reputation as a poet has been rather largely boosted by an album called An American Prayer, which came out after he'd died, and to which the Doors added musical backing to material that he'd spoken or sung. Because of that, people assume that Jim Morrison wrote all the lyrics for the Doors, which he didn't do. Obviously he delivered them, and the fact that the Doors tried a couple of albums after his death, which didn't work at all, proved that his delivery of those lyrics was pretty crucial, no matter who wrote them. So in a sense, it was the guy who served them up who was important, rather than who cooked them. As a lyricist, difficult to untangle what he did from what the other guys did. As a poet, perhaps buy American Prayer and decide for yourself.
If he died a couple of years earlier, it wouldn't have been half as effective. If he died when the Morrison Hotel or Soft Parade, it wouldn't have been nearly as effective. But to die having produced a good album, and to die in Paris and to die mysteriously is almost suspiciously well done. And it fitted with the Doors mythology. It had elements of sex and drugs and mystery. It couldn't have been planned better, and it happened at just the right time. And it's very hard to say with any certainty what would have happened if he hadn't died. It feels as if he'd kind of might have wandered away and gone into the desert and written poetry. Either way, I don't think it would have been that exciting. I think he, not to be cynical, but he died at just the right time. It was of a mythological piece.
Songs were great, both lyrically and musically. The players were outstanding. And Jim Morrison's voice, in terms of its tone and its passion and its commitment, is unparalleled.
I think they're not overrated. I don't think they're underrated. Their debut album was a great album for the time. The next few albums, kind of experimentation, maybe a bit all over the place, and then wrapping up with L.A. Women was a great way to bookmark a very short span. Great albums in such a short span. But they would be up there with one of the greatest, I wouldn't say rock bands, because I wouldn't say they were a rock, but they were just a great band.
Not your mother's or your father's child, yo. Our child, screaming wild. An ancient lunatic reigns in the trees of the night.
They did put out solo albums, they did put out Doors albums without Morrison, and they flopped. And that's cruel in a way, but it also makes tremendous sense in a way. The best pop and rock bands are a kind of alchemy that you can't repeat. And the same reasons they had arguments and so on are the same reasons that they were also good. There's a tension between the different elements of the people. And once that's gone, I don't think you can recreate it. As to whether they had an influence or not, again, I think that's looking at it in the wrong way. I'm not sure that rock music works that way. I'm not sure that people are influenced that much. You can't be Jim Morrison again because he was a product of the way he looked, the kind of childhood he had, the books he read, the late 60s in America. I don't think you can recreate that and do that again as a rock band.
Savior of the human race, up to face, up to face, up to face. You remember when we were in Africa?
Yeah, I think the Doors, you know, as far as standing the test of time, I think they will. When you have somebody like Morrison in the band, he's such a mythical legend now, not unlike, you know, Kurt Cobain and how he seems to be these days, or how his legend seems to be these days, I should say. I think the music is just going to stand the test of time. I think they're also lucky that some of it still sounds pretty damn good, too.
Are the Doors underrated? I don't think so. And proof of that really came in the latter part of the 1970s, the early 80s, when there was the resurgence of excitement about the Doors. I mean, you were seeing Jim Morrison t-shirts and posters everywhere, more than 10 years after the band was long finished. And it was a testament, obviously, to Jim, the poster child, the front man, but it was also a testament to the music of the band. It was able to appeal to generation upon generation upon generation. I think most people got the Doors. You either did or you didn't, but more people did, thankfully.
I am not afraid. What was that promise that you made? Why won't you tell me what she said? What was that promise that you made? I'm gonna love you till the heaven stops the rain.
They have a cult following that's extremely strong. I spend all day with people selling Doors, talking about the Doors. The Doors will live on. They're just as strong as the Beatles, as Led Zeppelin, or the Rolling Stones, or Jimi Hendrix. These bands will always be mind-catching, visually. Their music just sets them afire. I think the thing with the Doors also, and with the way Paul Rothchild produced, he was kind of like maybe a fifth member, because he was in with 5 or 6 of their albums, and he seemed to be always there. So I think he also was able to manage and have the right people in there to help control Jim for his moments of out of controlledness.
Touch me, babe. Can't you see that I am not afraid? What was that promise that you made? Why won't you tell me what she said? What was that promise that you made? I'm gonna love you till the heaven stops the rain. I'm gonna love you till the stars fall from the sky for you and I.
The fact that Doors albums still sell in pretty great quantities today illustrates the fact that people still think that they have some sort of relevance to the music we listen to now. I don't think they're regarded as a museum piece, and the fact that other bands have taken what they've done and built on it and used it as a cornerstone of their sound proves that the Doors are certainly rated by musicians. As far as the general public goes, if you were born, say, after 1965, 1970, perhaps the Doors will mean nothing to you, but go raid your parents' CD collection and give yourself a treat.